London, May 19th, 1536. The sun rose behind a blanket of gray clouds over the Tower of London, casting a dull light across the fortress that loomed above the city like a monument to both power and tragedy. In the inner courtyard, a scaffold had been hastily erected during the night. It was not the typical raised platform commonly seen in English executions, but a lower, more discreet structure. Its design was deliberate, built to accommodate a foreign swordsman and his unfamiliar blade. This was no ordinary execution. Whispers moved swiftly through the early morning air, carried on the breath of servants, guards, and onlookers. Today, they said, would mark an unprecedented moment in England's long and often bloody history. For the first time, a queen, an anointed sovereign consort, was to be executed. That queen was Anne Boleyn, the woman who had once turned the world of Henry VIII upside down, the woman for whom he had risked the wrath of the Pope, the Emperor, and his people, and had not merely stolen the king's heart. She had divided a kingdom, caused a break with Rome, and helped usher in the English Reformation. But now, on this bleak morning, she was no longer a queen in the eyes of the law. She was a condemned traitor awaiting death. Within the tower's cold stone walls, in a modest chamber that had become her prison for the past 17 days, and awoke to her final dawn. She was 35 years old, yet still bore the poise and refinement that had once captivated an entire court. Though stripped of title and surrounded by betrayal, she rose with dignity. The few ladies-in-waiting who had remained by her side helped her prepare. Every detail of her appearance was carefully considered. She chose a dark gray mantle lined with fur, somber, solemn, befitting the gravity of the day. Beneath it, she wore a crimson bodice, its deep red hue selected with chilling foresight. It would conceal the blood soon to be spilled. It was a choice made not in vanity, but in resolve, a final act of grace in the face of brutality. As she dressed and showed no outward fear, instead, she remarked quietly, "I hear the executioner is very good. I have a little neck." She touched her slender throat as she said it, a moment later recorded by witnesses. It was a comment laced with dark irony, a flash of wit and composure that revealed the steel within her. Even now, with the scaffold awaiting her, and refused to break, she would die with the same boldness that had defined her life. But how had it come to this? How had the woman who had once held England's king in the palm of her hand found herself kneeling before a foreign blade? Anne Boleyn's story began not in royalty, but in ambition. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a shrewd and upwardly mobile diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, who descended from one of England's most powerful noble families. From a young age, and was immersed in the elegant world of European courts. She was educated in the Netherlands and later served at the court of Queen Claude in France, where she absorbed the culture, intellect, and sophistication of the Renaissance. When she returned to England around 1522 and did not immediately stand out for her beauty. She did not possess the pale skin and golden hair so admired in Tudor England. Instead, she had olive-toned skin, long dark hair, and striking black eyes. Yet there was something undeniable about her. Her intelligence, wit, and confidence made her magnetic. She could command a room without uttering a word. And soon, she caught the attention of the most powerful man in the land. King Henry VIII, at the time still married to Catherine of Aragon, found himself drawn to, and in a way he had never been before. His marriage had failed to produce a male heir, and his frustration grew with each passing year. But when he attempted to pursue Anne, she refused to become his mistress. Her sister, Mary Boleyn, had already gone down that path, and would not follow. "If you want my body," she reportedly told the king, "you must give me a crown." It was a bold demand, unthinkable even, but Henry was captivated. What followed was 7 years of relentless pursuit and political upheaval. Determined to marry Anne, Henry sought an annulment from the Pope. When the church refused, he took matters into his own hands. He rejected the authority of Rome, established the Church of England, and declared himself its supreme head. This was no simple matter of personal desire. It was a religious and political earthquake, a moment that changed the course of English history forever. In January 1533, Anne and Henry were married in secret. She was already pregnant with what they both hoped would be the long-awaited male heir. But in September, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was immense. Still, Anne became queen. Her coronation was lavish, her power secure for a time. As queen, she was far from passive. She championed reform, encouraged the translation and circulation of the Bible in English, and surrounded herself with scholars and forward-thinking theologians. She wielded her influence with intelligence and purpose, and she believed in the righteousness of her position. But her assertiveness made enemies. At court, many resented her rise. The old nobility saw her as an upstart. The Catholic faithful viewed her as the root of England's religious rupture. And even within her own household, spies whispered and plotted. Her fate began to unravel not through scandal, but through tragedy. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne became pregnant again. But in 1534, she suffered a miscarriage. The pressure on her to produce a male heir was suffocating, and Henry's affections began to wane. The court grew colder. Then came another pregnancy in early 1536, but this too ended in miscarriage, possibly triggered by the shock of Henry's fall from his horse during a tournament, and reportedly believed that the child, a son, had been lost because of her distress. It was a devastating blow, both personal and political. In the weeks that followed, her enemies moved swiftly. Rumors of adultery, incest, and treason began to spread. Men close to her, including her brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges were flimsy, the evidence dubious, but in the volatile world of Tudor politics, truth mattered less than perception, and was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Her trial was a public spectacle, carefully orchestrated to seal her fate. Despite her eloquent defense and the glaring inconsistencies in the accusations, she was found guilty. The sentence, death by beheading. Now, on this gray May morning, that sentence was about to be carried out. The woman who had once worn England's crown was about to kneel before the sword, not because she had failed as a queen, but because she had dared to reach for the throne and succeeded. In the year 1535, Anne Boleyn suffered yet another devastating loss, her third failed pregnancy, this time of a male fetus. For a woman who had once captured the heart and reshaped the kingdom of Henry VIII, this failure marked a turning point from favor to fatal disillusionment. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir wasn't just a personal desire. It was a political necessity, one that drove his decisions, toppled religious institutions, and redefined the monarchy itself. The dream of a son had been the very foundation of his marriage to Anne. Without it, their union, already the subject of controversy and religious upheaval, began to collapse under the weight of expectation. His once burning passion for Anne cooled rapidly, giving way to disappointment, distance, and eventually disdain. Around them, the political winds shifted, and once the center of power and influence, became increasingly isolated. Her charm, intelligence, and boldness, once admired, now made her enemies all the more eager to see her fall. Among them was Thomas Cromwell, the king's powerful and cunning minister. Once an ally of and in the Reformation cause, Cromwell had now turned against her, viewing her as a threat to the stability of the crown and his own influence over it. By April 1536, the first whispers of conspiracy became deliberate action. Cromwell, with the king's approval or at least his silent consent, set in motion an investigation into the queen's personal life. What followed was a calculated campaign designed to build a case strong enough to destroy her, a case not grounded in truth, but in rumor, manipulated testimonies, and political necessity. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges brought against her were scandalous and sensational. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, as well as conspiring to murder the king and committing treason. These were not mere whispers behind palace doors. They were now matters of state, crafted to ensure that Anne's fall would be total and irreversible. To many observers, the accusations were absurd, a transparent fabrication. But in the court of Henry VIII, the truth had long ceased to matter. What mattered now was the crown's reputation, the king's legacy, and the removal of a queen who had outlived her usefulness. Anne's trial, held on May 15th, was a grim spectacle, more theater than justice. She was denied the basic rights of a fair defense, no legal representation, no opportunity to face her accusers. Instead, she stood alone before a jury filled with men who had every reason to want her gone. But even in that moment of extreme vulnerability and remained composed, she answered every accusation with calm intelligence, and even her enemies could not deny her poise. One observer, moved by her grace under pressure, remarked that she spoke with such wisdom and discretion that she seemed not a woman, but something almost angelic. Still, her fate had been sealed before the trial ever began. The verdict was swift and expected: guilty. The initial sentence handed down was death by burning, a brutal punishment reserved for women convicted of high treason. Yet in a final act that some saw as mercy and others as a calculated political move to soften the optics of the execution, Henry commuted her sentence to death by beheading. Moreover, he ordered a skilled executioner to be brought from France, one known for his precision with the sword, a small, cold comfort meant to ensure her end would be swift. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne woke knowing the end had come. She had been told her execution would occur at 8 o'clock. She prepared herself with quiet strength, praying, taking communion, and making peace with her fate. But then, just as she was ready to meet her death, news came that the execution had been delayed until noon. The psychological toll was immense. Those final hours stretched painfully as Anne sat with her thoughts, her faith, and her fears. In the silence of her chamber, she prayed with deep devotion, pausing often to repeat, "Lord, have mercy on me." She swore, upon the sacred host, that she had never betrayed the king, proclaiming, "For my salvation, I am free of the things for which I was condemned." Those present would later recall the serenity with which she faced her final hours, not the serenity of resignation, but the dignity of a woman who would not allow her enemies to rob her of grace. As noon approached, the sound of drums began to roll, signaling to the gathered crowd that the execution was near, and, ever composed, said her final goodbyes to her ladies-in-waiting. To each, she gave a small token, a prayer book, a piece of jewelry, a handkerchief, items now heavy with meaning. "Remember me and how I end?" she asked them gently, a plea not of self-pity, but of legacy. She was then led to the scaffold, where about 1,000 people had assembled. It was a smaller crowd than expected, and strangely, the mood was not one of bloodlust, but of subdued sorrow. Many in attendance removed their hats in silent respect as Anne approached, dressed in a modest gown of gray and crimson. She walked with quiet dignity, the same fierce spirit that had once captivated a king still visible in her final steps. Once on the scaffold, and was granted the opportunity to speak. Her final words were a model of restraint, honor, and forgiveness. "Good Christians," she began, "I come here to die according to the law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign Lord." There was no bitterness in her voice, no defiance, no protest, only a quiet acceptance, and a subtle reminder that she had once been beloved and had loved in return. Moments later, she knelt, and the French swordsman, quick and precise, ended her life with a single stroke. Anne Boleyn's rise and fall reshaped the course of English history. Her life, filled with ambition, intelligence, controversy, and courage, ended not in glory, but in silence. And yet, that silence echoed louder than any crown ever could. Her death was not simply the execution of a queen, it was a turning point in a saga of power, love, betrayal, and fate. Centuries later, her name still resonates as a symbol of how dangerous it can be for a woman to stand too close to power. Anne Boleyn's death is a tragic tale of grace under pressure, political maneuvering, and the price of defying the royal order. As she stood on the scaffold, moments before her execution, Anne's actions were those of a woman who had mastered the art of survival in a world that was both politically volatile and deeply unforgiving. The charges against her were not only false but manufactured with a deep and personal malice. Yet, Anne chose not to fight them. She did not try to proclaim her innocence, nor did she launch into accusations against her enemies. Instead, Anne made an intentional political choice that would resonate through history. In her final moments, she presented herself as a loyal subject to her king and country, preserving the dignity of the monarchy despite the betrayal she had suffered. Through this, Anne secured a place in history that would far outlast her death. By the very action she took on the scaffold, she ensured that her daughter, Elizabeth, would eventually rule a powerful England. In an extraordinary display of grace, Anne removed her mantle and cap, handing them to her ladies-in-waiting as if to symbolize her acceptance of fate, while also passing on her responsibilities as queen. One of her last acts was to offer the executioner a purse of gold coins, not out of fear or submission, but as a final, silent acknowledgement of the cruel task about to unfold. Her composure in this moment is a testament to her strength and the deeply political nature of her sacrifice. It was, in a sense, a political act to the very end, and knew that how she died would affect her legacy. And in these final moments, she ensured that her death would not be a disordered, angry one, but rather one that would reflect her dignity and intelligence. As Anne knelt on the scaffold, she noticed that no block was placed for her to rest her head, a subtle yet significant detail that marked the difference in the method of her execution. Traditionally, executions by axe required the condemned to lay their heads on a block, but Anne was to be executed by sword, which required the condemned to remain standing. This final indignity added another layer of cruelty to her fate, yet Anne remained composed. One of her ladies-in-waiting swiftly tied a blindfold over her eyes, and, with quiet devotion, whispered her final prayers. "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." In a final attempt to soften the blow, the executioner, following the French tradition, loudly inquired, "Where is my sword?" This momentary distraction was an attempt to divert Anne's attention before the fatal strike, and turned her head just enough for the executioner to take the opportunity he had been waiting for. The sword struck with brutal precision, severing her head in a single, clean stroke. The silence that followed was chilling, as the crowd collectively held its breath. Then, in a grim ritual, the executioner lifted her head by the hair, displaying it to the crowd with the cold proclamation, "So perish the king's enemies." However, the usual response from the crowd was notably absent. Instead of cheering, there was a palpable unease among the onlookers, as if they too felt the weight of the injustice that had just transpired. The thunder of cannon fire echoed across the river, signaling to Henry VIII, who was awaiting news at Whitehall Palace, that the path was now clear for his next marriage. The very next day, he formally became engaged to Jane Seymour, and within 10 days, they were wed. Anne's death had cleared the way for Henry's ambitions, but the legacy she left behind would have profound and unexpected consequences. In the immediate aftermath, Anne's body was hastily collected by her ladies-in-waiting. No coffin had been prepared for her, and no care had been taken to offer her any dignity in death. The guards, in a grim display of practicality, retrieved an empty arrow chest, and Anne's remains were placed inside it. Her severed head was laid beside her body, an image of brutality that further symbolized the erasure of her life. The makeshift casket was then transported to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a final resting place that was nothing more than an anonymous, unmarked grave beneath the cold stone floor. There, without ceremony, and was buried in a grave that would be lost to time, her identity and her legacy buried alongside her. Henry VIII's wrath extended even beyond her death, as he ordered that all portraits of and be destroyed, that her name be expunged from official records, and that any trace of her be removed from the royal palaces. This damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memory, was carried out so thoroughly that, to this day, there is no authenticated portrait of, and from her time, a symbol of the complete erasure Henry sought. Yet, despite his best efforts, Henry failed in his ultimate goal, to erase her from history. While Anne's death marked a tragic and unjust end to her life, her legacy would not be silenced. 23 years later, her daughter Elizabeth ascended to the throne of England, and in doing so, would not only surpass her father in political acumen, but would also become one of the most revered monarchs in history. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years, and under her reign, England became a dominant force on the world stage, securing its place in history as a global power. The stability and success that Henry VIII had desperately sought but never achieved would be delivered by Elizabeth, and in this way, sacrifices were ultimately realized through her daughter's reign. In 1876, during the restoration of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, workers unearthed human remains believed to belong to Anne. A small, delicate skeleton was discovered, and though no definitive proof was found to identify it as hers, the remains were reburied with a measure of respect, offering Anne a dignity in death that had been denied to her during her lifetime. This small act of recognition was a poignant tribute to a woman whose life had been tragically cut short, but whose impact was still deeply felt. Today, the site of Anne's execution is marked by a simple glass slab on the Tower of London's lawn. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, roses are laid there by admirers, a quiet and lasting tribute to a woman whose name was once erased, but whose legacy endured. For many, Anne Boleyn represents not only a tragic figure, but also a symbol of the unjust treatment of powerful women who dared to challenge the societal norms of their time. The irony of her story lies not only in the tragic events of her death, but also in the triumph that came long after her passing. Elizabeth I, upon her ascension to the throne, chose to honor her mother's legacy, adopting many of her mother's traits and even the white falcon emblem of the Boleyn family. Elizabeth's reign, prosperous and powerful, was built on the lessons her mother's life had imparted. In a way, the greatness that Elizabeth achieved as queen was born from the ashes of Anne's sacrifice. Sacrifices made on that cold May morning in 1536 when a queen, composed and dignified, walked toward her death.